Lieutenant General Victoria Washington's reflection stared back at her from the frost-kissed window of her government-issued vehicle as it wound through the early morning streets of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The November wind howled across Lake Michigan, sending waves of sleet against the reinforced glass. Her deep brown eyes, sharp with intelligence and weathered by 30 years of military service, remained focused on the classified documents spread across her lap. The upcoming cybersecurity briefing at the Wisconsin Strategic Command Center demanded her complete attention, even as the weight of responsibility pressed down upon her shoulders like a familiar but heavy cloak. At 53 years old, Victoria had earned every accolade that adorned her service record. 2 tours in Afghanistan, distinguished service in cyber operations, and now her position as the head of the Army's newly formed Digital Defense Initiative made her one of the highest-ranking African-American women in military history. The bronze stars and silver oak leaves that usually graced her uniform lay carefully packed in her briefcase, unnecessary for today's covert operation. Instead, she wore a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet authority rather than military might. Across town, at Milwaukee Mitchell International Airport, Head of Security Operations Thomas Blackwood began his morning routine with military precision, a habit carried over from his 20 years in local law enforcement. His starched white shirt and perfectly polished badge reflected the fluorescent lights of the security checkpoint as he surveyed his domain. At 62, Thomas took pride in running what he considered the most efficient and secure checkpoint in the Midwest. His steel gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of authority that he wielded like a weapon, particularly in the premium security lane reserved for first-class passengers. The morning crowds moved through the airport terminals in their usual patterns, a river of humanity flowing between gates and checkpoints. Among them, Junior TSA Officer Sarah Chun observed the proceedings with sharp eyes and mounting concern. At 28, Sarah had already witnessed enough instances of subtle discrimination to recognize the warning signs. The way Thomas's jaw would tighten when certain passengers approached his checkpoint, the almost imperceptible shift in his tone when addressing travelers who didn't fit his preconceived notion of first class. She had documented these observations carefully, building a quiet case that she had yet to present to her superiors. Victoria's driver, Master Sergeant James Rodriguez, navigated the slick Wisconsin roads with practiced ease. His 25 years of service had taught him to read the subtle signs of tension in his passengers, and this morning, the general's carefully controlled breathing and rigid posture spoke volumes. The classified briefing waiting at the Strategic Command Center concerned a potential breach in military cybersecurity systems, a threat that could compromise not only local operations but national security protocols. The weight of this responsibility showed in the slight furrow of Victoria's brow as she reviewed her notes. The airport's premium security lane stood as a symbol of privilege and efficiency, its polished floors and minimal wait times a stark contrast to the crowded main checkpoint. Thomas Blackwood had personally designed the screening protocols for this lane, taking pride in maintaining what he considered appropriate standards for first-class travel. His definition of these standards, though never explicitly stated, carried undertones of bias that had gone unchallenged for years. Sarah Chen's morning briefing included a notice about a high-priority traveler expected to pass through the premium lane, though the details were classified. The heightened security alert only added to the usual tension in the air, as TSA officers prepared for increased scrutiny of their procedures. Sarah's position near the document check station afforded her a clear view of Thomas's interaction with each passenger, and she found herself unconsciously documenting his behavior with even greater attention than usual. The classified documents spread across Victoria's lap detailed a sophisticated cyber attack targeting military training facilities across the Midwest. The Wisconsin Strategic Command Center had detected unusual patterns in their network traffic, suggesting a coordinated attempt to access sensitive training protocols and personnel files. The timing, just weeks before a major joint exercise with NATO allies, raised serious concerns about potential foreign interference. Victoria's expertise in cyber warfare and strategic operations made her the natural choice to lead the investigation, though the sensitive nature of the threat required her to travel without the usual military escort or identifiers. As Victoria's vehicle approached the airport, the sleet had given way to a heavy snow, reducing visibility and adding an additional layer of tension to the morning. Master Sergeant Rodriguez's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel, his military training evident in the precise adjustments he made to compensate for the deteriorating weather conditions. The digital display on the dashboard showed 7:15 a.m., leaving exactly 45 minutes until Victoria's departure time. Plenty of time under normal circumstances, but the weather and security situation demanded additional precautions. Inside the airport, Thomas Blackwood conducted his pre-shift inspection of the premium security lane with characteristic thoroughness. Each scanner, each barrier, each uniform was examined with critical eyes that had been trained by decades of law enforcement experience. His attention to detail had earned him numerous commendations throughout his career, but it had also fostered a rigid worldview that left little room for deviation from what he considered normal or acceptable. Sarah Chen's position at the document check station provided her with a unique perspective on the morning's operations. Her criminal justice degree and 3 years of TSA experience had taught her to recognize patterns in human behavior, and this morning, she noted with growing concern the increasing agitation in Thomas's demeanor. The weather delays and increased security protocols had already led to several tense interactions with passengers, and Sarah could sense the potential for conflict building like static electricity before a storm. Victoria's arrival at the airport's drop-off point coincided with a fresh burst of snowfall that swirled through the automatic doors, carrying with it the crisp scent of winter. Her briefcase, containing both classified materials and her military credentials, hung at precisely the regulation distance from her shoulder, a habit ingrained by years of service. The weight of responsibility settled around her like a familiar uniform as she moved through the terminal with measured steps, her mind already processing multiple scenarios and contingencies. The premium security lane stretched before her like a gauntlet, its polished floors and precise lines a reflection of Thomas Blackwood's rigid standards. The morning light filtering through the snow-streaked windows cast harsh shadows across the checkpoint, creating an atmosphere of heightened tension that seemed to affect both staff and passengers alike. Victoria approached the document check station with the same calm authority she had displayed in countless military briefings and combat situations, her credentials and first-class boarding pass ready for inspection. Thomas Blackwood's reaction to Victoria's approach was immediate and visceral, a response born from years of unconscious bias reinforced by his position of authority. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as they swept over her tailored suit, lingering for a fraction too long on her dark complexion before settling on the premium lane credentials in her hand. The subtle shift in his posture, a straightening of his already rigid spine, signaled the beginning of what would become a pivotal moment in both their lives. Sarah Chen observed the interaction from her position with growing apprehension, her trained eye catching the telltale signs of Thomas's prejudices surfacing. The premium lane, usually flowing with efficiency, seemed to hold its breath as Victoria presented her credentials. The other passengers, predominantly white businessmen in expensive suits, continued their morning routines seemingly oblivious to the tension building at the checkpoint. The classified documents in Victoria's briefcase carried information about potential security breaches that could compromise military operations across 3 states. The irony of being challenged by airport security while en route to address a critical national security threat was not lost on her, though her expression remained perfectly neutral. Years of navigating similar situations had taught her the value of measured responses and strategic patience. Thomas's voice carried the weight of assumed authority as he questioned Victoria's presence in the premium lane, his words carefully chosen to maintain a veneer of professional skepticism while masking deeper prejudices. The morning's harsh fluorescent lights cast stark shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of disapproval etched around his mouth. His hands, wrinkled but steady from decades of scrutinizing documents, moved with exaggerated slowness as he examined Victoria's credentials. The Wisconsin winter wind continued its assault on the airport's massive windows, creating an ethereal backdrop of swirling snow that seemed to amplify the tension of the moment. Other TSA agents began to take notice of the situation, their attention drawn to the unusual sight of their supervisor spending an inordinate amount of time examining a single passenger's documents. The efficiency of the premium lane, Thomas's pride and joy, began to falter as the line grew longer behind Victoria. Sarah Chen's hand moved instinctively toward her radio, her fingers hovering over the call button as she debated whether to intervene. Her morning briefing had included specific protocols for handling high-priority passengers, though the details of Victoria's identity and mission remained classified. The growing discomfort in her stomach told her that this situation was rapidly approaching a critical point that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Victoria maintained her composed demeanor, though decades of military training had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of escalating conflict. Her mind, sharp from years of strategic planning and crisis management, was already analyzing multiple scenarios and their potential outcomes. The classified nature of her mission added an extra layer of complexity to the situation, limiting her ability to simply present her military credentials and end the confrontation. The morning light filtering through the snow-streaked windows cast an almost theatrical quality over the scene, highlighting the stark contrast between Victoria's quiet dignity and Thomas's increasingly aggressive posture. Other passengers in the premium lane began to shift uncomfortably, some averting their eyes while others watched with poorly concealed interest. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had remained in the terminal following protocol, observed the situation from a discreet distance. His years of service had taught him to recognize potentially volatile situations, and his instincts were screaming that this confrontation was about to reach a critical point. The weapon concealed beneath his civilian jacket felt heavier than usual as he maintained his position, ready to respond if necessary while hoping his intervention wouldn't be required. Thomas Blackwood's world had always been defined by clear lines of authority and rigid expectations. The premium security lane represented more than just an efficient checkpoint. It was a manifestation of his beliefs about order, privilege, and who deserved to access certain spaces. Victoria's presence challenged these deeply held beliefs, forcing him to confront his own biases in a way that made him increasingly uncomfortable and defensive. The delicate balance of power at the security checkpoint began to shift as Victoria calmly produced additional identification, her movements measured and precise. The morning light caught the subtle gleam of the military ID card as it emerged from her wallet, casting a brief golden flash that seemed to illuminate the entire scene. Thomas Blackwood's reaction was immediate and profound, his face draining of color as the implications of his behavior began to register in his consciousness. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, the Wisconsin Strategic Command Center's chief of operations, sat in his office overlooking Lake Michigan, unaware of the drama unfolding at the airport. His computer screen displayed a series of increasingly concerning reports about unauthorized attempts to access military training protocols. The morning sleet rattled against his office windows as he reviewed the complex web of digital intrusions that had prompted Victoria's urgent visit to Milwaukee. Back at the checkpoint, Sarah Chun had begun documenting the incident in precise detail, her trained eye catching every micro-expression that crossed Thomas's face as realization dawned. The other TSA agents nearby had grown unnaturally still, their usual routines forgotten as they watched their supervisor grapple with the magnitude of his error. The premium lane, typically a model of efficiency, had ground to a complete halt. Victoria's mind processed the situation with military precision, analyzing the broader implications of this moment beyond the personal slight. Her decades of experience in handling sensitive situations told her that this incident could serve a greater purpose in addressing systemic issues within civilian security operations. The classified documents in her briefcase seemed to pulse with added urgency, a reminder of the critical mission that awaited her beyond this checkpoint. The snow outside had intensified, creating an almost ethereal backdrop to the unfolding scene. Through the massive terminal windows, the Wisconsin landscape had transformed into a white void, isolating the airport in a cocoon of winter silence. This meteorological isolation seemed to amplify the tension at the security checkpoint, where time appeared to move with glacial slowness. Master Sergeant Rodriguez maintained his position near the terminal's coffee shop, his military training evident in his carefully relaxed posture that belied his ready state of alertness. His eyes continuously scanned the growing crowd of onlookers, assessing potential threats while monitoring the situation at the checkpoint. The weight of his concealed weapon served as a constant reminder of the serious nature of Victoria's mission to Milwaukee. Thomas Blackwood's world had begun to crumble around the edges as the full weight of his actions pressed down upon him. His carefully constructed identity as a fair and professional security officer was dissolving in the face of irrefutable evidence of his own prejudice. The premium security lane, once his pride and joy, now felt like a stage where his worst qualities had been put on display for all to see. Airport Operations Manager Patricia Morrison received the first report of the incident while reviewing staffing schedules in her third-floor office. Her 25 years of aviation security experience had taught her to recognize potentially volatile situations, and the details emerging from the premium checkpoint set off immediate alarm bells in her mind. The morning's weather conditions had already put the airport on edge. This situation threatened to push things over the edge. The influence of Victoria's military bearing began to ripple through the checkpoint area, affecting everyone in its vicinity. Junior TSA officers straightened their postures unconsciously, responding to the quiet authority that emanated from her presence. Even passengers waiting in line seemed to sense the shift in power dynamics, their initial irritation at the delay transforming into something approaching respect as they observed Victoria's composed handling of the situation. Sarah Chen's documentation of the incident had grown more detailed with each passing moment. Her notepad contained precise timestamps and descriptions of Thomas's behavior, creating a record that would later become crucial in the investigation that followed. Her criminal justice training helped her recognize the broader implications of this confrontation, understanding that it represented more than just a single instance of discrimination. The classified nature of Victoria's mission added layers of complexity to the situation that only she and Master Sergeant Rodriguez fully understood. The cybersecurity threat she had been summoned to address carried potential ramifications for national security, making the delay at the checkpoint more than just a personal inconvenience. Every minute spent dealing with Thomas's prejudice was another minute during which military systems remained vulnerable to potential breach. The realization of Victoria's true identity spread through the airport security staff like a shockwave, transforming the atmosphere from one of tension to profound discomfort. Thomas Blackwood's authority, once absolute within his domain, began to dissolve like snow in warm rain. His hands, which had so confidently blocked Victoria's path moments before, now trembled slightly as he processed the magnitude of his error. The 3-star insignia on her military identification card seemed to burn into his vision, a stark reminder of the massive gulf between appearance and reality. Meanwhile, in the Secure Communications Center of the Wisconsin Strategic Command Center, Colonel Jennifer Hayes monitored a series of increasingly alarming digital intrusions. Her team had detected sophisticated attempts to penetrate the military's training databases, with digital fingerprints suggesting state-sponsored cyber warfare. The snow-laden morning had brought with it a fresh wave of attacks, making Victoria's delayed arrival increasingly problematic. The irony of a critical military asset being hindered by civilian prejudice was not lost on Colonel Hayes as she watched another warning flash across her screens. Patricia Morrison, the airport operations manager, had already begun implementing emergency protocols designed for high-profile security incidents. Her office, situated high above the main terminal, provided a perfect vantage point to observe the ripple effects of the confrontation spreading through the airport. 25 years of aviation security experience had taught her to recognize potentially explosive situations, and this one carried all the hallmarks of a major incident in the making. The premium security lane had become an inadvertent stage for a drama that would reshape policies and careers. Other passengers, predominantly white business travelers in expensive suits, watched with a mixture of discomfort and fascination as the scene unfolded. Some began to recognize their own complicity in a system that had allowed such prejudices to flourish, while others simply shifted uncomfortably and avoided eye contact. Sarah Chen's careful documentation of the incident continued, her trained eye-catching details that would later prove crucial. The slight tremor in Thomas's hands as he realized his mistake, the almost imperceptible straightening of Victoria's spine as she maintained her dignified composure, the way other TSA agents began to distance themselves physically from their supervisor, all were noted with professional precision. Her criminal justice degree had taught her the importance of thorough documentation in cases of institutional discrimination. Master Sergeant Rodriguez maintained his position of quiet vigilance, his military training evident in the way he continuously scanned the growing crowd while appearing completely at ease. The weapon concealed beneath his jacket remained a silent reminder of the serious nature of Victoria's mission to Milwaukee. His years of service had taught him to recognize the delicate balance between necessary security and potential overreach, making the current situation particularly poignant. The winter storm outside continued to intensify, creating an almost surreal backdrop to the unfolding drama. Through the massive terminal windows, the Wisconsin landscape had disappeared entirely behind a curtain of white, lending an air of isolation to the scene. The harsh fluorescent lights of the security checkpoint created sharp shadows that seemed to emphasize the lines of tension in every face. Victoria's mind remained focused on the larger mission at hand, even as she dealt with the immediate situation. The classified documents in her briefcase contained details of cyber attacks that could compromise military readiness across the entire Midwest. Every minute spent addressing Thomas Blackwood's prejudice was another minute during which vital military systems remained vulnerable. Yet she understood that this moment carried its own significance in the ongoing battle against discrimination and bias. The sophisticated cyber attacks targeting military installations across Wisconsin had already breached preliminary defenses at 2 training facilities. Colonel Hayes's team had managed to contain the initial intrusions, but the attackers' persistence suggested a level of organization and resources that pointed to state-sponsored warfare. The irony of Victoria being delayed by domestic prejudice while foreign adversaries attempted to breach national security was not lost on those who understood the full scope of the situation. Thomas Blackwood's career, built over decades of service in law enforcement and airport security, began to crumble before his eyes. Each second that passed seemed to strip away another layer of the authority he had wielded so confidently just moments before. The premium security lane, which he had treated as his personal domain, now felt like a prison of his own making. The polished floors and efficient design that he had once proudly showcased now seemed to mock his fall from grace. The weight of institutional failure pressed down upon the airport terminal like the heavy Wisconsin snow outside. Victoria's presence had inadvertently exposed not just one man's prejudice, but an entire system's complicity in allowing such bias to persist. Airport Director Michael Sullivan, receiving urgent updates in his top-floor office, recognized that this incident would have repercussions far beyond a single security checkpoint. His 30 years in aviation administration had taught him to recognize watershed moments, and this had all the markings of one. In the Cybersecurity Command Center at the Wisconsin Strategic Command Center, Colonel Hayes's team detected another wave of sophisticated intrusion attempts. The attackers, emboldened by the delay in response, had begun targeting more sensitive systems. The digital displays showed a complex web of attack vectors, each one probing for weaknesses in the military's cyber defenses. The technical expertise evident in these attacks suggested involvement from a highly trained foreign intelligence service, making Victoria's delayed arrival increasingly critical. Sarah Chen's documentation of the incident had grown into a comprehensive record of institutional bias in action. Her notebook contained not just details of Thomas's behavior, but also the reactions of other staff members, the subtle shifts in power dynamics, and the ways in which various airport personnel had enabled or ignored discriminatory practices over time. What had started as routine observation had evolved into something approaching a case study in systemic discrimination. The premium security lane, once a symbol of efficiency and privilege, had transformed into a stark representation of societal prejudices. Regular passengers continued to filter through other checkpoints, but the premium lane stood frozen in time, caught in the gravity of the unfolding situation. The morning light filtering through the snow-streaked windows cast long shadows across the polished floors, creating an almost theatrical setting for this drama of authority and accountability. Victoria maintained her composed exterior, though decades of military service had taught her to recognize the broader implications of this moment. The classified documents in her briefcase seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, their contents a reminder of the critical mission being delayed by this display of prejudice. Her mind processed multiple scenarios simultaneously, evaluating both the immediate situation and its potential long-term impact on military-civilian relations. Master Sergeant Rodriguez observed a subtle shift in the crowd's dynamics. His extensive security training allowed him to detect the changing attitudes of onlookers as they began to grasp the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Some passengers had started recording the scene discreetly on their phones, while others engaged in hushed conversations about what they had observed. The incident was already moving beyond the confines of the airport, spreading through social media and private messages. Airport Security Operations Center analyst Lisa Martinez monitored the situation through the facility's extensive camera network. Her screens displayed multiple angles of the confrontation, capturing every detail for what would inevitably become an internal investigation. Her 10 years of experience in security operations had taught her to recognize significant security incidents, but this one carried implications that extended far beyond standard protocols. Thomas Blackwood's world continued to collapse inward as the full implications of his actions became clear. Each breath felt heavier than the last as he stood rigid in his now meaningless authority. The premium security lane, which he had governed with such rigid control, had become the stage for his professional undoing. The carefully maintained facade of impartial security enforcement had cracked, revealing the prejudices that lay beneath. The Wisconsin winter storm intensified outside, creating an increasingly isolated atmosphere within the terminal. The howling wind and swirling snow visible through the massive windows seemed to amplify the tension inside. The airport's normal rhythms had been disrupted, creating a pocket of suspended time where every action carried additional weight and significance. The ripple effects of the confrontation began spreading through different levels of authority. Airport Director Sullivan had already initiated emergency protocols, recognizing that this incident could potentially affect national security. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from various department heads, each seeking guidance on how to handle the escalating situation. The weight of institutional responsibility pressed down upon him as he drafted urgent communications to military liaison officers and civilian aviation authorities. Meanwhile, at the Wisconsin Strategic Command Center, the situation had reached a critical point. Colonel Hayes's cybersecurity team detected increasingly sophisticated attempts to breach their systems. The digital attacks had evolved from simple probing attempts to coordinated assaults on multiple security layers. The attackers, sensing an opportunity in the delayed response, had intensified their efforts to access classified training protocols and personnel files. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson's office at the command center had transformed into an emergency operations center. Multiple screens displayed real-time data about the cyber attacks, while secure communications channels relayed updates about Victoria's delayed arrival. The irony of having one of the military's top cybersecurity experts held up by civilian prejudice while foreign actors attempted to breach their defenses was not lost on anyone in the room. Back at the airport, Victoria's mind processed the situation with military precision, evaluating multiple aspects simultaneously. The classified documents in her briefcase contained critical information about vulnerabilities in military cybersecurity systems across the Midwest. Every minute spent dealing with Thomas Blackwood's prejudice represented another minute during which these systems remained at risk. Yet she understood that her handling of this situation could have lasting implications for civil-military relations and institutional racism. Sarah Chen's documentation had grown more detailed with each passing moment. Her training in criminal justice helped her recognize patterns of institutional behavior that had enabled such discrimination to flourish. She noted how other security personnel had begun distancing themselves from Thomas, their body language revealing a growing awareness of their own complicity in a system that had allowed such prejudices to go unchecked. The premium security lane had become a metaphorical stage where larger societal issues played out in microcosm. The harsh airport lighting cast sharp shadows across the faces of onlookers, highlighting expressions of discomfort, shame, and growing awareness. Some passengers had begun using their phones to discreetly record the scene, understanding that they were witnessing something significant. Master Sergeant Rodriguez maintained his vigilant position, though his military training allowed him to detect subtle changes in the crowd's dynamics. Years of experience in high-pressure situations had taught him to recognize the signs of shifting power structures. The other passengers in the premium lane, predominantly white business travelers, showed varying degrees of discomfort as they witnessed the dismantling of previously unquestioned authority. The winter storm outside continued to intensify, creating an almost symbolic isolation of the scene. The swirling snow visible through the terminal's massive windows seemed to create a barrier between this moment and the outside world, as if nature itself was providing a stage for this confrontation between prejudice and progress. The Wisconsin weather had effectively trapped all participants within this moment of reckoning. The morning's events had triggered a cascade of responses throughout the airport's administrative hierarchy. Deputy Airport Director Rachel Martinez, monitoring the situation from the airport's Emergency Operations Center, had already begun implementing crisis management protocols. Her 20 years of experience in aviation administration told her that this incident would have far-reaching implications beyond just security procedures. The monitors before her displayed multiple camera angles of the premium security checkpoint, each view capturing a different aspect of the unfolding drama. In the Wisconsin Strategic Command Center's secure communications room, the situation had become increasingly dire. Colonel Hayes's team detected new patterns in the cyber attacks, suggesting a coordinated effort from multiple foreign actors. The digital assault had evolved from mere probing attempts into a sophisticated multi-layered attack targeting critical military infrastructure. The technical expertise displayed in these attacks bore the hallmarks of state-sponsored cyber warfare, making Victoria's delayed arrival even more critical. The premium security lane had transformed into a symbolic battlefield where institutional prejudice faced off against earned authority. Thomas Blackwood's once firm grip on his domain continued to crumble as the full weight of his actions pressed down upon him. The security cameras captured every micro-expression that crossed his face, from the initial arrogance to the dawning horror of recognition, each moment preserved for what would inevitably become a comprehensive investigation. Victoria's military training had prepared her for countless scenarios, but this situation tested different aspects of her leadership abilities. The classified documents in her briefcase contained urgent information about vulnerabilities in military cybersecurity systems. Yet she recognized that her handling of this civilian confrontation could have lasting implications for military-civilian relations. Her calm exterior masked the complex calculations running through her mind as she assessed both immediate and long-term consequences of each potential response. Sarah Chen's careful documentation of the incident had grown increasingly detailed. Her notebook recorded not just actions and reactions, but the subtle shifts in power dynamics throughout the terminal. She noted how other TSA agents had begun exhibiting signs of distress, their previous acceptance of discriminatory practices now causing visible discomfort. The premium lane, once a symbol of efficiency and privilege, had become a stark reminder of systemic bias. Master Sergeant Rodriguez observed the growing crowd with practiced vigilance. His position near the coffee shop offered a clear view of both the security checkpoint and the surrounding terminal area. Years of military service had taught him to recognize the signs of mounting tension in civilian crowds. The mix of emotions displayed by onlookers, shock, embarrassment, anger, and recognition, created an increasingly volatile atmosphere. The Wisconsin winter storm continued its assault on the airport's exterior, the howling wind and swirling snow creating an almost theatrical backdrop to the unfolding drama. The weather had effectively isolated the terminal, trapping all participants within this moment of institutional reckoning. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast dramatic shadows across the scene, highlighting the stark contrasts between authority and justice, prejudice and progress.